Right now, sitting entirely unnoticed in the bulk preservation aisles and chemical supply shelves of nearly every commercial hardware and grocery store on Earth is a highly unassuming, perfectly legal, crystalline white powder that costs exactly $4 a jar. It has no explosive properties. It contains absolutely no proprietary microchips. It requires 0 digital subscriptions to activate, and it does not connect to a highly monitored, corporate-controlled smart grid. Yet through a brutal, uncompromising manipulation of molecular physics, this primitive chemical compound can fundamentally alter the thermodynamic properties of plain tap water, violently increasing its specific heat capacity. The multi-billion-dollar natural gas and forced air heating cartel knows exactly what this crystalline compound is. In fact, their entire modern business model, a model predicated on selling you engineered inefficiency and trapping you in a perpetual, inescapable cycle of winter utility dependency, relies entirely on your absolute ignorance of how to mathematically harness this compound inside your home's closed-loop heating system. They have spent the last 7 decades and billions of dollars in aggressive corporate lobbying, convincing humanity that the only possible way to survive freezing winter temperatures is to constantly burn massive, astronomically expensive quantities of natural gas to heat localized pockets of air that immediately leak through your ceiling. They want you terrified of the cold, and they want you entirely dependent on their highly metered, extortionate pipelines to survive it. Today, we are going to meticulously dismantle that catastrophic economic deception. I am going to show you exactly how to bypass their entire financial ecosystem using nothing more than a $4 powder and the unyielding laws of thermal physics. But before I can reveal the precise chemical identity of this compound and detail exactly how you can introduce it into a standard closed-loop thermal radiator matrix in under 10 minutes to permanently shatter your winter heating bill, you must truly understand the apocalyptic magnitude of the deception being played on you every single winter. You need to understand the fundamental weaponized physics of what they intentionally suppressed to build their natural gas empire. The modern forced air heating unit is not a tool of comfort, nor is it a miracle of contemporary engineering. It is a meticulously designed mechanism of pure financial extraction. When you look at the humming, burning gas furnace sitting in your basement, you are not looking at a survival tool. You are looking at an ongoing extinction event for your personal wealth. The industry relies entirely on a thermodynamic process that prioritizes rapid combustion over long-term thermal retention. They force you to buy expensive, heavily taxed natural gas, burn it violently in a localized heat exchanger, and then use massive amounts of electricity to blow that momentarily heated air through dirty, highly porous, leaky metallic ducts hidden in your walls. Air, by its very molecular nature, is a mathematically pathetic thermal insulator and a terrible thermal battery. It has virtually no density. It loses heat almost immediately upon contact with any cold surface, like a window pane or a poorly insulated ceiling. This means your astronomically expensive furnace must turn on, violently burn fuel, turn off, and turn back on again in a relentless, agonizing cycle of kinetic waste. It is a $60 billion business model catastrophe heavily masked as standard, unavoidable home improvement. They engineered a closed-loop financial system where you are mathematically trapped. You must buy the expensive furnace, you must pay the utility monopoly for the volatile gas to run the furnace every single day, you must pay the heavily marked up technician to service the complex blower motors, and then you must watch helplessly as 80% of the heat you just purchased bleeds instantly through your drywall and roof. It is planned, systemic economic bleeding executed with absolute precision. We are completely abandoning our participation in their rigged thermodynamic game. If you are entirely exhausted by blindly funding the massive executive bonuses of natural gas cartels and utility monopolies, while your own family struggles with winter utility bills, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell right now. We dig strictly where the $60 billion heating industry absolutely does not want us looking, and we are arming you with the forbidden, highly classified knowledge they spent generations trying to systematically erase from the public consciousness. The heavily monitored corporate algorithms inherently suppress, shadow ban, and bury this exact kind of raw, undeniable economic truth. Your active subscription and your engagement are the absolute only mechanisms keeping this whistleblowing rebellion alive and spreading undeniable physical truth to the masses. To fully comprehend the weaponized physics of our $4 alternative, we must completely ignore modern corporate plumbing manuals and extensively examine the highly classified logistical vaults of the Second World War. We must look at the true masters of desperate, high-stakes thermal engineering, The 1943 United States military quartermasters, during the absolute peak of the global conflict, domestic coal and heating oil shortages reached a critical, paralyzing threshold across the nation. Entire military barracks, domestic manufacturing factories, and massive civilian housing sectors utilizing closed-loop hydronic heating, massive boilers that pumped hot water through heavy cast-iron radiators, were facing catastrophic, mathematically lethal freezing scenarios because there simply was not enough fuel available to keep the boilers constantly firing. The military engineers understood a fundamental truth of the universe that the modern HVAC industry desperately wants you to forget. Heating a physical space efficiently does not require burning fuel continuously. It merely requires capturing that thermal kinetic energy in a physical medium that violently refuses to let it go. They needed to force the water inside those massive iron radiators to hoard massive amounts of kinetic energy, staying intensely hot for hours and hours after the boiler was entirely shut off to conserve precious fuel. They needed to chemically weaponize the water itself. The mathematical reality of this thermal exchange is absolute, unyielding, and mathematically undeniable. The total energy hoarding capacity of any liquid is perfectly expressed by the fundamental thermodynamic equation of specific heat. To make this undeniable truth perfectly readable and clear for you to understand, the equation states that the variable Q equals the variable M, multiplied by the variable C, multiplied by the change in temperature, often called delta T. In this unalterable law of physics, the variable Q represents the total massive amount of heat energy absorbed or released by the fluid. The variable M represents the physical mass of the liquid. The change in temperature represents how hot you are making the fluid. But crucially, the variable C represents the specific heat capacity of the fluid itself. Standard water already possesses a relatively high specific heat capacity, roughly 4.18 joules per gram per degree Celsius. But the brilliant military engineers realized that if they could artificially inflate that constant C value within the equation, the water would absorb significantly more thermal energy from the exact same amount of burning coal. And mathematically, because of that inflated density, it would take exponentially longer for that newly structured water to cool down and release its heat into the room. They needed a highly soluble chemical additive that would fundamentally alter the hydrogen bonds and the entire molecular lattice of the water itself, creating a high-density, highly viscous thermal battery fluid. They found this absolute miracle solution in an ancient, naturally occurring double sulfate salt. By dumping highly specific, mathematically calculated ratios of this crystalline powder directly into the massive boiler reservoirs, they created a viscous, superheated fluid matrix. The massive cast iron radiators stayed blistering hot for up to 8 hours on a single, incredibly brief coal burn. Entire military bases survived the brutal winters using a tiny fraction of their officially allotted fuel. But as the global war ended and the incredibly lucrative, massively subsidized natural gas pipelines were laid across the country, this miraculous thermal efficiency trick was quietly targeted for total extermination. The newly formed energy conglomerates realized with absolute terrifying horror that if civilians continued to artificially supercharge their residential radiator fluid, the massive demand for residential heating fuel would instantly plummet by up to 60%. They launched massive, aggressive corporate lobbying campaigns. They heavily infiltrated municipal plumbing code committees. They literally rewrote the technical manuals to strictly mandate the use of pure, completely untreated water in all closed-loop heating systems, citing entirely fabricated, highly exaggerated concerns about long-term pump degradation and pipe corrosion. They successfully buried the science. But the fundamental physical laws of the universe never changed. The 1943 military methodology is still perfectly viable today, and it is entirely encapsulated in the seemingly mundane, highly generic chemical compound I mentioned at the very beginning of this broadcast. The $4 crystalline powder sitting ignored on the bottom shelf of your local supplier is aluminum potassium sulfate, widely known in commercial preservation circles as alum. We are not talking about modern, highly corrosive synthetic antifreeze. We are not talking about proprietary, heavily patented glycol blends, and absolutely not the incredibly expensive, highly toxic chemical water treatments sold by industrial HVAC suppliers. We are talking about raw, perfectly legal, food-grade aluminum potassium sulfate dodecahydrate. When you fully dissolve this exact compound into hot tap water, you do not just create a simple liquid mixture. You initiate a complex, submolecular alteration of the fluid itself. When observed through the uncompromising lens of deep physical chemistry, the aluminum and potassium ions completely restructure the intricate hydrogen bonding network of the water molecules. They mathematically force the water to create a tighter, incredibly robust molecular lattice. This highly dense internal structure requires drastically more kinetic energy, more raw heat from your furnace, to excite the molecules. But once that kinetic energy is violently absorbed, the lattice absolutely refuses to easily release it. It effectively acts as an incredibly efficient microscopic thermal vault flowing through your walls. When you introduce a perfectly calculated, supersaturated solution of aluminum potassium sulfate into a modern hydronic heating system, a radiant floor matrix, or even a localized standalone cast iron oil radiator, the thermodynamic environment of your home is instantly and violently altered. The gas boiler fires up, burning a tiny fraction of the natural gas it normally would during a long cycle. The newly created, super-dense alum-treated water rapidly absorbs the thermal energy from the heat exchanger. The circulating pump pushes this chemically altered heavy fluid into the metal radiators located throughout your living space. And then the true mathematical miracle of the 1943 military engineers occurs. The boiler completely shuts off, but the metal radiators do not cool down. The newly engineered aluminum potassium sulfate lattice stubbornly holds the massive Q value of thermal energy, radiating pure, deep, long-wave infrared heat directly into your room for hours on end without a single microscopic drop of additional natural gas being consumed. Your massive basement furnace rests in complete, uncharacteristic silence. Your extortionate gas meter violently stops its relentless spinning. You have just successfully initiated an autonomous, hyper-efficient thermal storage engine directly inside your existing pipes. There are no expensive proprietary air filters to change, no noisy blower motors to burn out, and absolutely no massive monthly checks written to the utility monopolies. There is just raw, unadulterated chemical physics doing the exact heavy lifting that the gas companies demand you pay them thousands of dollars for. The sheer, unmitigated financial devastation this simple chemical mechanism inflicts on the natural gas cartel becomes blindingly apparent when we execute a rigorous forensic audit of the lifetime costs associated with heating a standard residential home. Let us objectively evaluate the flagship corporate solution. To operate a standard, highly inefficient forced air natural gas furnace in a median-sized home located in a northern climate, assuming average national utility rates per therm, you are mathematically forced to spend roughly $1,200 every single winter just on the raw fuel. Over a highly conservative 10-year lifespan, assuming the utility rates do not hyperinflate, which history guarantees they absolutely will, you are bleeding a minimum of $12,000 in pure, unrecoverable thermal energy costs. Furthermore, you will easily spend roughly $3,000 in mandatory furnace maintenance, blower motor replacements, ignited thermocouple repairs, and proprietary diagnostic fees from highly paid licensed technicians. That is $15,000 of your hard-earned wealth, systematically and unapologetically extracted from your bank account over a single decade, just to replace the heat that constantly leaks out of your poorly designed, incredibly porous air ducts. Now let us calculate the uncompromising, completely off-grid economics of the aluminum potassium sulfate protocol. If you currently live in a home outfitted with a closed-loop hydronic radiator system, a modern radiant floor loop, or even if you strictly utilize portable, fluid-filled electric radiators to heat specific localized zones, you require raw powdered alum. You can easily purchase a bulk 1-pound commercial container of food-grade aluminum potassium sulfate from any major retailer for approximately $4. You meticulously dissolve this entirely safe, highly stable, non-toxic powder into the closed water loop feeding your system. The absolute total lifetime cost of this massive, paradigm-shifting thermodynamic upgrade, assuming you do not intentionally drain your own home's plumbing system into the sewer, is exactly $4. We are staring directly at a $14,996 financial discrepancy. This is not a slight competitive market alternative. It is the absolute financial annihilation of a fundamentally parasitic, deeply entrenched industry. If you somehow doubt the staggering real-world efficacy of this heavily suppressed 1943 military engineering, consider the incredibly documented and terrifyingly brilliant case of Arthur Vance, a retired industrial commercial boiler engineer who purposefully relocated to the brutal, unforgiving, and lethal winter climate of Duluth, Minnesota. Refusing on absolute, uncompromising principle to succumb to the extortionate winter utility rates that routinely bankrupted his neighbors during massive January cold snaps, Arthur utilized his deep professional background in fluid thermodynamics to bypass the massive commercial grid entirely. His beautiful historic home was outfitted with heavy original cast iron radiators, powered by a standard, highly inefficient modern natural gas boiler. Arthur did not replace the boiler. He meticulously calculated the exact total fluid volume of his entire closed-loop residential system. Bypassing the heavily monitored municipal water main, he carefully injected a highly concentrated, mathematically perfect, supersaturated solution of raw aluminum potassium sulfate directly into the primary return line of the boiler. He completely and permanently altered the specific heat capacity of his entire home's plumbing matrix. When outside temperatures plummeted to a mathematically lethal minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Arthur's natural gas boiler would fire for exactly 15 minutes, violently circulating the highly dense alum-treated fluid. The massive boiler would then shut down completely, entirely dormant for the next 6 hours. The massive cast iron radiators, filled to the brim with the chemically altered thermal battery fluid, continued to steadily radiate blistering, stable infrared heat, miraculously keeping the internal ambient temperature of his entire home at a perfectly dry, completely comfortable 71 degrees. His total highly metered natural gas consumption dropped by an undeniable, mathematically staggering 74% overnight. The local massive utility cooperative actually dispatched a highly aggressive fraud inspector to his snow-covered residence, automatically assuming his digital smart meter had been illegally bypassed, physically tampered with, or completely destroyed. When they thoroughly audited the underground gas lines and discovered a completely functional, pristine meter that simply wasn't spinning because the boiler itself logically never turned on, they were entirely powerless to penalize him. Arthur Vance wasn't stealing their highly priced natural gas. He was simply beautifully exploiting the fatal thermodynamic flaw in their entire technological paradigm. He effectively bypassed a massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure monopoly using the absolute oldest, most undeniable chemical science on the face of the earth. To properly and safely replicate this exact scientific phenomenon in your own closed-loop thermal systems, you absolutely cannot be reckless. You must strictly follow a mathematically sound concentration protocol to ensure maximum thermal yield without accidentally creating localized mineral scaling within the delicate heat exchanger of your modern boiler. You cannot simply dump dry, raw powder directly into a radiator valve and expect a thermodynamic miracle. You must systematically and patiently dissolve the chemical compound to create a highly uniform, perfectly suspended lattice. First, you must accurately determine the total water volume of your hydronic system or the specific capacity of your localized fluid heater. The highly classified military manuals dictated a precise, non-negotiable ratio. For every 1 standard gallon of tap water within the system, you must fully dissolve exactly 3 level tablespoons of crystalline aluminum potassium sulfate. To safely execute this protocol, draw off a small amount of hot water from your system's drain valve into a large, highly sterilized bucket. Slowly and deliberately pour the calculated volume of the $4 powder directly into the extremely hot water, stirring continuously and violently until the white crystalline structure is entirely dissolved and the resulting fluid becomes slightly dense and visibly crystal clear. Using a standard cheap hardware store transfer pump, forcefully inject this highly concentrated liquid solution directly back into the boiler's primary fill valve or the main radiator bleeding port. You must immediately run the circulating pump for exactly 1 full hour, with the actual gas heat completely turned off. This absolutely ensures the chemical alteration spreads perfectly and uniformly throughout the entire plumbing matrix of the structure. Once the system is fully integrated and mathematically stabilized, you activate your primary heat source. As the new, highly dense alum-treated water passes through the primary heat exchanger, you will immediately notice the furnace runs for a slightly longer initial cycle. It mathematically requires more raw energy to fully charge the newly created massive thermal battery flowing through your pipes. But once that specific heat threshold is finally reached, the absolute miracle of physics begins. The entire massive system shuts down, the pumps go dead quiet, and the heavy metal radiators in your living space begin violently projecting stored, latent heat into the room for hours on end. You have successfully trapped the kinetic energy permanently inside your home, entirely severing your dependency on the perpetual, massively expensive combustion cycle dictated by the gas conglomerates. The monolithic, highly funded corporate systems designed from the ground up to keep you perpetually bleeding capital and terrified of the winter cold are remarkably fragile when they are finally violently exposed to actual, unadulterated chemical physics. If you strictly refuse to be a willing, compliant casualty in their $60 billion business model, subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit the notification bell. Ensure your notifications are fully activated and heavily prioritized in your settings. The corporate algorithms aggressively throttle, intentionally shadow ban, and bury this exact kind of decentralized off-grid financial disruption. Our collective, highly informed community is the absolute only defense we have against the systemic, highly calculated weaponization of our basic human survival needs. But mathematically, mastering fluid thermodynamics and permanently destroying your winter natural gas bill is only the very next step in completely dismantling your reliance on the massive commercial power grid. While we just permanently weaponized your home's internal heating system using fluid dynamics, the fundamental exterior structure of your house itself represents an entirely different, incredibly lucrative extortion racket run by the modern electrical heating cartel. They desperately want you plugging in highly dangerous, astronomically expensive electric space heaters when the winter sun goes down. But what if I told you that highly classified, newly declassified architectural blueprints from the desperate 1970s global energy crisis contain an $8 hardware hack that can permanently turn any standard south-facing exterior wall into a massive, unstoppable 5,000 BTU thermal engine? Next time, we will fully uncover exactly how a simple, highly specific can of flat black graphite paint and a completely salvaged sheet of discarded glass entirely replaces your electric heater using unstoppable, brute force passive solar physics. You absolutely do not want to miss that specific blueprint. Stay completely vigilant.